Hi, I am Amit Rawat, and in this video, I am reviewing the book Siddhartha by Herman Hesse, written in 1922. And as a matter of fact, it is still very relevant. This book asks critical questions to its readers. When I first picked up the book, I expected a spiritual novel. What I didn't expect was how relevant it would feel to modern life. It reminded me that success, failure, love, wealth, and even suffering can also become teachers if we are willing to learn from them. Siddhartha turns orthodox Hinduism inside out. His thoughts were clean and clear. He thought that a true seeker could not accept any doctrine without living it. Just knowing it is not enough. When you are knowing, you are and not living it, you are knowing but living the life of somebody else. Finally, seeker even rejects seeking, concluding that ultimate reality can never be captured in a net made of thoughts, and knowing has no worse enemy than desire not to know. Siddhartha was born in a Brahmin family. From a very young age, he was considered different. He was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply interested in understanding the world around him. He studied the Vedas and the sacred teachings of his tradition, and he became well versed in the knowledge that was available to him. He also had a close friend, Govinda. Govinda was almost always by his side. He admired Siddhartha deeply and followed him wherever his search took him. Like Siddhartha, Govinda was intelligent and spiritually curious, but there was something different between them. Siddhartha was not simply interested in learning what others had already discovered. He wanted to understand the truth for himself. And despite knowing so much, despite performing prayers and rituals, and despite having the respect of everyone around him, Siddhartha felt that something was missing. There was an emptiness inside him. Question kept arising in his mind. If the Vedas contains the truth, why had he not found peace? If the rituals were meant to bring him closer to the divine, why did he still feel incomplete? And if the teachers themselves had found the ultimate truth, why could they not give that experience to him? The more Siddhartha learned, the more he realized that knowing about something was not the same as experiencing it. And that realization became the beginning of his journey. But even as a young man, Siddhartha's mind was restless. He knew the verses, he knew the rituals, he knew the mantras, but behind all this knowledge, there were questions that refused to leave him. He would wonder, does sacrifice really bring happiness to life? Why are the mantras of the gods are so beautiful, so rhythmic and captivating? Is Prajapati is truly the creator of this world, or is it the Atman, the Brahman, the self that created everything? Is God really something separated from us, or what else is there that we can sacrifice for? And perhaps the simplest question was also the most difficult. Where is the God? These were not just questions Siddhartha asked because he had lost respect for his tradition. He asked them because he wanted to understand it completely. He didn't want to simply repeat what the teachers had taught him. He wanted to know whether what they spoke about could actually be experienced. And this was the contradiction growing inside Siddhartha. The more he learned about the divine, the more he felt that he had not actually found it. He could recite the sacred words, he could perform the rituals, he could meditate, but somewhere inside him a voice kept asking, if all this is true, why have I still not found what I am searching for? And that question would eventually become stronger than his desire to remain where he was. It would lead Siddhartha away from his home, away from everything familiar, and into a journey where he would spend the rest of his life searching for an answer that no teacher could simply give him. One day, a group of samanas arrived near Siddhartha's village. They were wandering ascetics who had renounced ordinary life. They owned almost nothing, They wandered from place to place, lived simply, and devoted themselves to meditation and spiritual discipline. To Siddhartha, there was something fascinating about them. They seemed free, they were not tied to wealth, family, status, or the expectation of society. And Siddhartha began to think, perhaps this is the life I have been searching for. Perhaps the answer would not be found by studying more scripture or performing more rituals. Perhaps he needed to leave everything behind and experience the truth for himself. So Siddhartha went to his father and asked for permission to leave the home and join the Samanas, but his father refused. Siddhartha for him was not just a son, he was the son he had raised with great hopes, a brilliant young Brahmin who was expected to continue the tradition of his family. But Siddhartha had already made up his mind. That night he stood silently in his father's room. His father told him to go. Siddhartha remained standing. Hours passed. His father went to sleep. Siddhartha stood there. He woke again and found his son in the same place, still standing, still silent, still determined. And eventually his father understood that this was not a passing desire. Siddhartha had already chosen his path. His father finally gave him permission to leave, and the next morning Siddhartha walked away from his home to join the Samanas. But he did not leave alone. His closest friend Govinda had been watching his journey from the beginning. Govinda admired Siddhartha deeply, and when Siddhartha decided to leave, Govinda chose to follow him. Together, the two young men left behind everything they knew, their families, their comfortable lives, their status, and the world in which they had grown up. They walked into the forest to begin a completely different life, a life of discipline, sacrifice, searching, a life in which Siddhartha hoped he would finally find the answer to the question that had been troubling him since childhood: where is the truth? Siddhartha and Govinda spent years with the Samanas. They lived a life of extreme discipline. They fasted, they meditated, they deprived themselves of the comfort of the body, and Siddhartha became exceptionally skilled at meditation. He learned to enter a deep state of concentration, to detach himself from his body, and to temporarily lose his sense of individual identity. In these states, he could imagine himself becoming other forms of life, like birds, animals, or another living being. For Siddhartha, these experiences were extraordinary. He was becoming very good at what the Samanas taught him, but there was still one problem. He was not satisfied. One day, Siddhartha looked at the old Samana who had been his teacher. The man had spent decades practicing these same disciplines, decades of fasting, decades of meditation, decades of trying to overcome the body and the self. And Siddhartha began to wonder, if these practices are true, the path to liberation, why my teacher is still searching? If after so many years he had not been attained nirvana, what exactly had all these years of practice achieved? Siddhartha realized that he could become better and better at meditation, but perhaps he would still be standing at the same place. He could escape his body, he could escape his thought, he could even experience what it felt like to become something completely different. But sooner or later he would always return to himself, and the question remained, had he actually found the truth, or had he only learned how to escape the question? Siddhartha finally understood that the Samanas could teach him techniques, but perhaps they could not give him what he was searching for. He told Govinda that they should leave. Their next destination was not yet certain, but they had heard stories about a man who was different from all teachers they had known, a man who was said to have attained what they were searching for. His name was Gautama, the Buddha. And so Siddhartha and Govinda once again left everything behind. They began wandering in search of Gautama. This time Siddhartha was not looking for another technique. He was looking for someone who had actually found the answer, and that search would bring him face to face with Buddha itself. Siddhartha and Govinda wandered for a long time in search of Gautama. Eventually, they reached his sanctuary, and for the first time, Siddhartha came face to face with the man they had heard so much about, the Buddha. Siddhartha watched him carefully. He observed him from head to toe. There was something about Gautama that Siddhartha had never been seen in any another human being. A complete stillness, a kind of peace. There was no arrogance in him, no struggle, no need to prove anything. He simply seemed to be at peace with himself. They then listened to his teachings. Govinda was completely mesmerized. For Govinda, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He believed that Gautama had found the path and he wanted to follow him. Siddhartha, however, felt something different. He knew that Gautama had found that he himself was searching for. There was no contradiction in Buddha's words, no obvious mistakes. His teaching was beautiful and complete, and yet Siddhartha still could not follow him because Siddhartha wanted something that no teaching could simply give him. He wanted to experience nirvana himself. For Govinda, the Buddha was the destination. For Siddhartha, the Buddha was proof that the destination existed. But Siddhartha still wanted to find his own path to it. And so, for the first time, the two childhood friends had to separate. Govinda chose the Buddha, Siddhartha chose the unknown. Before leaving, Siddhartha met his childhood first friend one last time. The same Govinda who had followed him almost like a shadow since they were young. Siddhartha then approached the Buddha and said in essence, "My friend has chosen to follow you, but I have decided to continue my journey." And Buddha simply replied, "As you wish." There was no argument, no attempt to convince Siddhartha, no anger, just acceptance. And perhaps that was another thing Siddhartha learned from the meeting him. The Buddha did not need to force his truth upon anyone. As Siddhartha walked away, he realized something extraordinary. There had been no mistake in Buddha's teaching. He had encountered a man who seems to have truly found the center of his one consciousness, a man who had found peace, and yet Siddhartha still chose to walk away. He lowered his eyes before the Buddha, but as he left, he made a silent promise to himself. From this moment onward, I will not lower my eyes before anyone, not because he had become arrogant, but because he had decided that he would never again surrender his search to someone else's doctrine. If he was going to find the truth, he would have to find it himself. And there was another feeling inside him. For a moment, it almost felt as if the Buddha had taken Govinda away from him, his closest friend, the person who had followed him everywhere, his childhood's companion. But at the same time, Siddhartha realized something else. The Buddha had also given him something back. He had returned him to himself, the curious Siddhartha, the questioning Siddhartha, the man who refused to stop searching, and now Siddhartha was no longer the innocent boy who had left his father's home. He was becoming a young man, and for the first time in his life, he was completely alone. No father, no teacher, no Govinda, no doctrine to follow, only himself, and an enormous question ahead of him. If no one else can show me the way, then where do I go from here? After leaving the Buddha, Siddhartha found himself completely alone. He began thinking deeply about everything that had happened. He had left his father's home, he had spent years with Samanaj, he had mastered meditation and learned to enter deep states of consciousness, and finally he had met the Buddha himself. But now Siddhartha made a decision. He would leave all of it behind. He would leave the path of sacrifice. He would leave the path of samadhi. He would no longer follow someone else's doctrine. He wanted something different now. He wanted to experience life itself. And he thought about Govinda. Govinda had chosen to become one of the Buddha's thousands followers. But Siddhartha wondered, was Govinda really living his own life? Or was he simply living according to the Buddha's doctrine? Was he following his one path or someone else's? Siddhartha did not know the answer, but he knew what he had to do. So he walked and walked, leaving behind everything he had known. He traveled for days and nights through the river world, through the river, wilderness, and eventually reached a river. He was exhausted, his clothes were torn, and almost he had nothing left. There, beside the river, he met a ferryman. The ferryman allowed Siddhartha to stay in his small hut for the night, and after spending so many nights sleeping in the wilderness, simply having a roof over his head felt almost strange. The next morning, the ferryman carried him across the river. Siddhartha had no money to pay him, but the ferryman did not demand anything. He simply told Siddhartha that perhaps one day he would return and repay him. Siddhartha then continued towards the city, and what he saw there was completely different from the world he had known as a Samana. Here was wealth, beautiful clothes, food, pleasure, business, love, and people living lives that Siddhartha had once considered completely beneath him. But now he wanted to experience them. On this way into the city, he encountered a woman who approached him with the desire. For the first time, Siddhartha saw something that was completely unfamiliar to the ascetic life he had lived. The simple world of spiritual discipline suddenly seemed very far away. Then he heard about a woman named Kamala. Kamala was beautiful, wealthy, and highly respected. She lived surrounded by luxury and elegance. Siddhartha was fascinated by her. But there was one problem. He arrived wearing the torn clothes of a wandering ascetic, and no one like that could simply walk into Kamala's world. So Siddhartha changed his appearance. He cut his hair, dressed properly, began to look like a man who belonged in the city, and eventually he met Kamala. He told her that he wanted her to teach him art of love. Kamala was amused. She asked him in effect, how can a man who has lived in the forest know anything about love? And Siddhartha realized that even though he had learned how to control his body and mind, there was entire parts of human life that he never experienced. So he began to learn from Kamala, but to remain in this new world, he needed money. And Siddhartha discovered that the skills he had developed as a samana, his intelligence, discipline, patience, and ability to remain calm were extremely useful in the world of business. He began working for a wealthy merchant, and he was remarkably successful. Money came, fine clothes came, good food came, respect came, and year passed, and Siddhartha became wealthy. He became part of the very world he had once rejected, but somewhere along the way something happened that he didn't notice immediately. The man who once spent his life searching for enlightenment had stopped searching. The man who had wanted to discover his one truth was now spending his days helping another man building his wealth. But he had entered the world to experience it. But slowly the world began to experience him. And Siddhartha, almost without realizing it, began to forget the question that had brought him this far. Who am I? Who am I? And even more importantly, what am I searching for? Years passed. Siddhartha continued to live in the world of wealth and pleasure. He was successful, respected, he had money, and he had Kamala. But something inside him had slowly begun to die. Kamala herself was changing. She was getting older, and as the year passed, she began to understand that Siddhartha was still searching for something that neither wealth nor pleasure could give him. Eventually, Kamala wanted something more from life. She wanted a child, and she had a son with Siddhartha. But Siddhartha was still not fully aware of what was happening inside him. He had spent so many years trying to experience everything the world could offer, and he had almost forgotten the person he had once been. Then one day something inside him broke. He looked at his life and realized that he had traveled in a complete circle. He had once rejected worldly life because he believed it would never give him peace. And now, after years of wealth and pleasure, he had discovered exactly that. It could not give him peace. Siddhartha left the city. He walked back towards the river, exhausted, emotionally empty, and almost completely broken. He lay down beside the river water. For a moment, he felt that he had failed. All his searching experiences, attempts to find truth brought him anywhere, and then he heard the river. The same river he crossed years earlier, the same river he had been waiting for him all along. And this time Siddhartha did not try to escape, he listened. He stayed, and eventually he returned to the ferryman. The ferryman's name was Vasudeva, and Vasudeva was unlike the teacher Siddhartha had known before. He didn't try to explain enlightenment, he didn't give Siddhartha a philosophy. He simply listened to the river and taught Siddhartha to listen too. The two men began living together. They worked as a ferryman. They carried people across the river. They lived simply, ate simply, worked, listened, and slowly Siddhartha began to understand something that years of studying and meditation had never taught him. The river was speaking, not with words, but through its endless movement. It seems to contain everything: laughter and tears, youth and old age, birth and death, love and loss. Everything flowed away, and yet everything was still connected. Then one day, Siddhartha past returned to him. Kamala was traveling towards the river with their son. She had bitten by a snake, and before Siddhartha could truly understand what was happening, Kamala died. But she left something behind, his son. For the first time in his life, Siddhartha discovered something far more powerful than meditation. He discovered fatherhood. He loved his son desperately, perhaps too desperately. He wanted to protect him, he wanted to teach him, he wanted his son to understand life the way he had come to understand it. But his son had grown up surrounded by wealth. He had known a completely different world. He did not want the simple life of a ferryman. He did not want Siddhartha's philosophy. Neither he wanted the river. But Siddhartha could not accept it. He tried to hold on to his son. He tried to make him stay. But the more he tried to control him, the more distant the boy became. Eventually, his son ran away, and Siddhartha was devastated. This was perhaps the greatest suffering he had ever experienced, because now he understood something he had never understood before. He had become attached. He became a father. He had experienced the pain of losing someone he loved. For the first time, Siddhartha could understand the suffering of ordinary people in a way that no meditation had ever allowed him to. He finally understood what it meant to love someone so deeply that their pain becomes your own. And he also understood something else. You cannot choose another person's path for them, not even to your own child. Siddhartha had spent his entire life searching for freedom, but now he had to learn to give freedom to someone else. Vasudeva saw Siddhartha's suffering, but he did not give him a lecture. Instead, he took him back to the river, and together they listened. Siddhartha began to hear something he had never heard before. Not one voice, but many voices. The voices of people, voices of joy, voices of suffering, voices of birth and death. And somehow all those voices become one, the single sound, the Om. And Siddhartha began to understand life was not divided into success and failure, good and bad, pleasure and pain, past and future. Everything belonged to one whole. He finally understood why his journey had taken him through so many seemingly opposite experiences: the Samana, the Buddha, Kamala, wealth, desire, failure, fatherhood, loss, the river. None of these experiences had been separate from his search. They had all part of it. And this is where Siddhartha finally understood something that he had been searching for his entire life. The truth could not be found by rejecting life, and it could not be found by blindly following someone else's teaching. It had to be lived, experienced, loved, lost, and finally accepted. Vasudeva knew that Siddhartha had reached the place he had been searching for, and now Vasudeva's one journey was becoming to was coming to the end. He walked away from the river and disappeared into the forest. He had become one with the truth, and truth he had spent his life listening to, alone with the river. But he was no longer the same man who had arrived these years earlier. He no longer needed to search, he no longer needed another teacher. He simply listened, and the river seemed to contain everything. The entire world, the entire journey, the past, the present, the future, all existing together. And Siddhartha finally understood. He had not been traveling towards enlightenment. He had been living through it. Years later, Govinda was still traveling as a Buddhist monk. One day he heard about an old ferryman who was said to possess great wisdom. He came to the river, and there, after all those years, he found Siddhartha, his childhood friend. Govinda did not immediately recognize him. They began talking. Govinda asked questions. Siddhartha did not give him a doctrine. He did not tell him to follow his teaching. Instead, he spoke about experience, about life, about river, and Govinda still struggled to understand. So Siddhartha asked him to come closer. Govinda looked at his face, and in the moment something happened. He saw Siddhartha smiling, not the smile of someone who had conquered the world, not the smile of someone who had found an intellectual answer, but the smile of someone who had finally accepted the whole of life. Govinda saw countless images, people, animals, birth, death, love, suffering, joy, everything flowing into everything else. And for a moment Govinda understood, not because Siddhartha had explained it, but because he experienced it. The same lesson Siddhartha had been learning his entire life. Truth can not simply be taught, and perhaps that is why Siddhartha never became another Buddha. Govinda had followed him as a boy, then he followed the Buddha, and now at the end of their journey, he once again bowed before Siddhartha. But this time it was not because Siddhartha had given him a doctrine, it was because for one brief moment Govinda had seen what Siddhartha had spent his entire life trying to understand, and Siddhartha smiled, the same smile that Buddha had once carried, a smile of peace, a smile without desire, a smile without resistance, a smile that seemed to say, everything is already here, the search is over, and river continues to follow. And Siddhartha has finally found what he had been looking for, not in a scripture, not in a teacher, not in sacrifice, not in wealth, not in pleasure, but in life itself. And that is Siddhartha's journey towards nirvana. Thank you for listening. This was the book Siddhartha by Herman Hessie, and I am Amit Rawat. Thanks a lot.